The November wind cut through downtown Denver like a blade, slicing between the glass towers and concrete buildings with merciless precision. 16-year-old Marcus Chen pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his thin frame, knowing it wouldn't make much difference. The cold always found a way through, between the torn seams, through the holes in his sneakers, into his bones. He'd been on the streets for 8 months now, ever since his foster family decided they couldn't handle him anymore. That's what Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice tight with frustration after he'd missed curfew 3 times in 1 week. Marcus hadn't bothered explaining that he'd been working late shifts at the diner, trying to save money for when he aged out of the system. Nobody wanted to hear excuses from a foster kid. The sidewalk near 16th Street Mall was crowded with holiday shoppers, their arms loaded with bags from stores Marcus had never set foot in. They flowed around him like water around a stone, careful not to make eye contact, not to acknowledge the lanky teenager with the overstuffed backpack and dirt-stained clothing. He'd become invisible, just another fixture of urban poverty that people preferred not to see. Marcus checked his phone, a cracked iPhone 6 he'd found in a dumpster months ago. The battery was at 8%, and he had nowhere to charge it. He'd spent the previous night at the youth shelter on Lawrence Street, but they had a 3-night-per-week limit, and he'd already used up his quota. Tonight, he'd have to find somewhere else, somewhere the police wouldn't roust him at 2 a.m. for loitering. His stomach growled, sharp and insistent. He'd eaten half a sandwich he'd found behind a Panera Bread that morning, but that had been hours ago. The church on Welton Street served dinner at 6, but it was only 3:30 now, and the temperature was dropping fast. The weather app on his dying phone showed a storm front moving in, snow expected overnight, temperatures plummeting into the teens. Marcus started walking toward Union Station, where at least there'd be warmth and cover for a few hours before security kicked him out. His mind was already calculating. Where could he sleep tonight that wouldn't get him arrested or frozen to death? The parking garage on Spear Boulevard had some covered areas, or maybe the loading dock behind the King Soopers on Broadway, if the overnight crew hadn't started arriving yet. That's when he first saw the dog. It was sitting at the corner of 17th and Wynkoop, watching him with unusual intensity. Not a purebred anything, a scrappy mix of shepherd and who knows what, with matted brown and black fur, and one ear that flopped forward while the other stood up. The dog looked about as rough as Marcus felt, ribs visible beneath its dirty coat, but its eyes were alert and intelligent. Marcus had learned to be wary of stray dogs. Most were scared and unpredictable, and the last thing he needed was a bite that would send him to the emergency room with medical bills he could never pay. But this dog wasn't acting aggressive. It just sat there, tail giving small, tentative wags, as if it recognized something in Marcus that made them kindred spirits. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said softly, stopping a few feet away. "You lost too?" The dog stood up, shook itself, and took a few steps closer. Up close, Marcus could see it was male, probably 2 or 3 years old, with a red nylon collar that had no tags. Someone had owned him once, cared enough to put a collar on him, then either lost him or abandoned him. Marcus understood that feeling intimately. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the other half of the sandwich he'd been saving for later. The dog's nose twitched, but it didn't lunge or snatch. It waited, patient and polite, until Marcus held it out. The sandwich disappeared in 3 quick bites. "That's all I got," Marcus said, showing his empty hands. "Sorry, man." The dog licked his hand, warm tongue rasping against Marcus's chapped skin. It was the first gentle touch Marcus had felt in weeks, and something in his chest tightened unexpectedly. He blinked hard against the sudden sting in his eyes. "Yeah, okay," he muttered, reaching out to scratch behind the dog's ears. The fur was dirty and tangled, but the dog leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "Guess we're both on our own, huh?" Marcus started walking again, heading toward Union Station, and the dog fell into step beside him. He should probably try to lose it. He had enough problems without adding a stray animal to the mix. But the dog stayed close, matching his pace perfectly, and Marcus found he didn't have the heart to chase it away. They walked together through the downtown streets as afternoon slipped toward evening. The dog stayed right at Marcus's left side, weaving through pedestrians with practiced ease. When they reached Union Station, Marcus found a spot near the Great Hall where he could sit with his back against the warm interior wall. The dog settled down next to him, close enough that Marcus could feel its body heat. Around them, commuters rushed past, business people heading to the light rail, tourists checking their maps, families herding children toward the train platforms. No one looked at the homeless teenager and his stray dog companion. Marcus closed his eyes just for a moment, savoring the warmth of the building and the unexpected comfort of having another living creature nearby. The dog's breathing was steady and calm beside him. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this chance meeting on a cold Denver afternoon, was about to change everything. Security rousted them at 7:15. "You can't sleep here, kid," the uniformed guard said, not unkindly but with the firm tone of someone who'd had this conversation 1,000 times. "This isn't a shelter. You need to move along." Marcus gathered his backpack without argument. Fighting never helped. It just got you banned from places where you might catch a few warm hours later. The dog stood up with him, staying close as they pushed back out into the night. The temperature had dropped significantly. Marcus's breath came out in visible puffs, and the dog's did too. The animal looked up at him, and Marcus could swear there was a question in those brown eyes. "Now what?" "Yeah, I'm wondering the same thing, buddy," Marcus said quietly. The snow had started, light flurries that caught in the streetlights like falling stars. Beautiful, if you weren't about to spend the night outside in it. Marcus's mind raced through his dwindling options. The parking garage was looking like the best bet, but it would be brutally cold, even in a covered area. They walked west on 19th Avenue, away from the downtown core. The dog stayed right beside him, occasionally pressing against Marcus's leg as if offering support. Marcus had never had a pet. Foster care didn't allow for that kind of stability, but he was beginning to understand why people loved dogs. This animal asked for nothing except companionship, gave warmth and loyalty without conditions. "I should give you a name," Marcus said as they walked. "Can't keep calling you dog or buddy." He thought for a moment, watching the animal's confident gait despite its obvious hunger and neglect. "How about Scout? You kind of look like you're scouting ahead." The dog's tail wagged in response, and Marcus smiled despite everything. "Scout it is." They were heading toward the parking garage when Scout suddenly stopped, ears perked forward. The dog stared intently down a side street that led toward the highway, and beyond it, the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The snow was falling harder now, swirling in the wind. "What is it?" Marcus asked, following the dog's gaze. He saw nothing unusual, just empty streets and the distant glow of highway lights. Scout whined, a low sound in his throat, and took a few steps in that direction. He looked back at Marcus, then at the mountains, then back again. "You want to go that way?" Marcus shook his head. "Dude, that's insane. It's freezing and there's nothing out there but wilderness." But Scout was insistent, pulling forward with surprising determination. The dog walked a few more steps, stopped, looked back. The message was clear. "Follow me." Every rational part of Marcus's brain said this was stupid. Going toward the mountains in a snowstorm was how people died. But then again, what were his alternatives? A parking garage where he might freeze anyway? At least if they kept moving, they'd stay warmer. And something in Scout's behavior suggested purpose, not random wandering. "This is probably the dumbest thing I've ever done," Marcus muttered. But he followed. They walked for over an hour, leaving the city lights behind as they headed west on surface streets. The snow was accumulating now, a white blanket that muffled sound and made everything look unfamiliar. Marcus's feet were numb in his inadequate sneakers, and his hands were shoved deep in his pockets, fingers aching with cold. Scout kept moving with apparent confidence, never hesitating at intersections, always choosing a path that led steadily upward into the foothills. They passed the last gas station, the last convenience store, until there was nothing but darkness and the shapes of mountains against the slightly lighter sky. "Scout, seriously, we need to turn back." Marcus said, his voice shaking with cold. "This is too far." But the dog had stopped at the base of a hiking trail. Even in the darkness, Marcus could see the wooden sign, Mount Falcon Park Trail. He'd heard of it, a popular hiking area west of Morrison, miles from downtown Denver. Scout started up the trail without hesitation. Marcus stood there, shivering, facing a choice: turn back and try to make it to the city before hypothermia set in, or trust this stray dog who seemed to know where he was going. It was insane. It was dangerous. It made no logical sense. Scout stopped about 20 yards up the trail and barked, once sharp and commanding. Then he waited. Marcus thought about the parking garage, about sleeping alone on concrete with his backpack as a pillow. He thought about waking up every hour as his body temperature dropped, about the very real possibility that he might not wake up at all. He thought about Mrs. Patterson's tired face when she told him to pack his things. He thought about 8 months of being invisible, of making himself smaller and quieter, of the slow erosion of hope. And he thought about Scout, who had appeared out of nowhere, who had chosen Marcus just as surely as Marcus had chosen him. "All right," Marcus said, taking a deep breath of frigid air. "I'm trusting you, Scout. Don't make me regret this." He started up the trail. The snow was falling steadily now, covering the path, making footing treacherous. Marcus's phone died completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by ambient light reflecting off the snow. Scout stayed just ahead, visible as a dark shape against white, leading Marcus deeper into the mountains. Marcus had no idea where they were going. But for the first time in 8 months, he wasn't alone. And somehow that made all the difference. They climbed for what felt like hours. Marcus's legs burned with exhaustion, and his lungs ached from sucking in freezing air. The trail had become steep and treacherous, covered in several inches of fresh snow that concealed rocks and roots. He'd slipped twice, catching himself both times before he could tumble backward down the slope. His hands were so cold they'd gone past pain into numbness, and his face felt like frozen leather. But Scout never wavered, never slowed. The dog moved with purpose, occasionally looking back to make sure Marcus was still following, then pressing forward through the storm. The wind had picked up, howling through the pines and sending snow whipping horizontally across the trail. Visibility was nearly zero. Marcus was operating on pure trust now. Trust in this animal he'd known for less than 4 hours. Trust that there was some destination worth this brutal climb. Trust that he wouldn't die on this mountain tonight. Just when Marcus thought he couldn't take another step, Scout stopped. They'd reached a small plateau, sheltered somewhat by a rock outcropping. The dog barked twice, then disappeared around the side of the rocks. "Scout!" Marcus called, panic flaring. "Don't leave me up here." But the dog reappeared almost immediately, barking again, more insistent. Marcus staggered forward, using his hands against the rock face to steady himself, and rounded the outcropping. At first, he thought his frozen brain was hallucinating. Built into the side of the mountain, camouflaged by rocks and decades of vegetation growth, was a structure, not a cave, something man-made. A door, or what had once been a door, set into a concrete frame. Most of the door itself had rusted away, leaving an opening about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Scout was already squeezing through. Marcus dropped to his knees and peered inside. The opening led to darkness, but it was shelter, actual walls and a roof between him and the deadly storm. He didn't hesitate. He pushed his backpack through first, then crawled after it, scraping his shoulders against the rough concrete frame. The relief from the wind was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus lay on the floor just inside the entrance, gasping, his body shaking violently with cold and exhaustion. Scout was there, pressing against him, sharing what little body heat he had. After a few minutes, Marcus's breathing steadied enough that he could think again. He fumbled in his backpack for the small flashlight he kept there, a cheap thing he'd bought at a dollar store, but it still worked. His frozen fingers struggled with the switch, but finally, light flared. What it revealed made Marcus's jaw drop. They were in some kind of bunker or military installation. The room they'd entered was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a ceiling supported by metal beams. Everything was covered in dust and debris, and the air smelled of rust and earth. But the structure was sound, solid walls, an intact ceiling, protection from the elements. A doorway on the far wall led deeper into the structure. Marcus got shakily to his feet, using the wall for support, and moved forward with Scout at his side. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing more rooms. The next chamber was larger, perhaps 20 feet across. Metal shelving units lined the walls, most empty but some still holding supplies. Boxes of deteriorated paper goods, empty metal containers, a few glass jars whose contents had long since turned to unidentifiable sludge. In one corner stood a metal cabinet, its door hanging open to reveal nothing but darkness within. "What is this place?" Marcus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. They explored further. A narrow corridor led to what appeared to be living quarters, 3 small rooms, each containing a metal frame bed with a rotted mattress. Another room held the remains of what might have been a kitchen or storage area, with a cast-iron stove against one wall and a manual water pump that looked like it hadn't functioned in decades. The deepest room they found was the most surprising. It was clearly an office or command center of some kind. A large metal desk dominated the space, and on the walls were faded maps, topographical surveys of the area, some marked with cryptic symbols and notations. Filing cabinets stood against one wall, their drawers slightly open, papers visible inside. On the desk, covered in dust, was a logbook bound in cracked leather. Marcus picked it up carefully, sending up a small cloud of dust. He opened it, shining his flashlight on yellowed pages covered in neat handwriting. November 12th, 1962. Construction complete. Site F-17 now operational. Cold War contingencies in place. May this shelter never be needed. Colals. James Whitmore, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. A Cold War bunker. Marcus breathed. This is a freaking Cold War bunker. He flipped through more pages. The logs detailed regular inspections and supply checks through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. Then the entries became less frequent, more perfunctory. The last entry was dated September 1979. Final inspection, site to be decommissioned, surplus materials to be recovered when budget allows. Apparently, the budget had never allowed. The place had been abandoned and forgotten for over 40 years. Marcus walked back through the rooms with new eyes, his mind racing despite his exhaustion. This wasn't just shelter for a night. This was a fully contained structure, hidden from the world, completely off-grid. The roof was solid, the walls were thick concrete, and while the place was filthy and deteriorated, the basic integrity seemed sound. He returned to the first room where Scout waited. The dog had found a relatively clean corner and was already curled up, nose tucked under his tail. His eyes tracked Marcus as the teenager moved around the space. "Scout," Marcus said quietly, sinking down beside the dog, "I think you might have just saved my life." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the forgotten bunker, Marcus and Scout were warm, dry, and safe. For the first time in 8 months, Marcus allowed himself to think beyond surviving the next 24 hours. Maybe, just maybe, this could be something more. Marcus woke to absolute silence. For a moment, disoriented in the pitch darkness, he panicked. Where was he? Then Scout shifted against his side, warm and solid, and memory flooded back. The bunker, the mountain, the storm. He fumbled for his flashlight, grateful he'd left it within reach. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the concrete walls and his breath misting in the cold air. It was freezing in here, but nothing compared to what it would have been outside. Through the rusted doorway, he could see daylight, grey and weak, but daylight nonetheless. His body ached everywhere. The climb, the cold, sleeping on concrete. All of it had taken a toll, but he was alive, and that was more than he'd expected 12 hours ago. Scout was already awake, watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. The dog stood and stretched, then moved toward the entrance. "Yeah, okay, I hear you," Marcus said, his voice rough with sleep. "You need to go out." They squeezed through the opening together. The world outside was transformed. Everything covered in at least a foot of fresh snow, the sky clearing to reveal patches of blue between grey clouds. The storm had passed. The air was crisp and brutally cold, and Marcus's breath came out in thick clouds. Scout trotted off to do his business, and Marcus did the same, finding a spot away from the bunker entrance. When they reconvened, Marcus stood looking out over the landscape, trying to orient himself. Through the trees he could see Denver sprawled out below, miles away, and looking almost unreal from this distance, a grid of buildings and streets that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. "We really climbed high," Marcus muttered. His legs reminded him of every step. They went back inside, and Marcus began a more thorough exploration in the daylight filtering through the entrance. The bunker was in rough shape, no denying that. But the more he looked, the more potential he saw. The main living area was structurally sound. The metal shelving could be cleaned and used. The old stove was cast iron. If he could figure out how to vent it properly and get firewood, it might actually work. There was even a chimney pipe, though he'd need to check if it was still clear. The sleeping quarters were less promising. The mattresses were completely ruined, black with mold and decay. But the metal bed frames were solid. If he could find replacement mattresses, or even just padding of some kind, they'd be usable. The biggest discovery came when he investigated the water pump more closely. It was a manual system, the kind you had to work with a handle, and it looked ancient. But when Marcus experimentally tried the handle, it moved. Stiff, resistant, but it moved. He worked it back and forth, and after a dozen pumps, something gurgled deep in the mechanism. Scout came over to watch, tail wagging with what looked like encouragement. Marcus kept pumping. The gurgling grew louder. Suddenly, with a rush of air and a metallic groan, water spurted from the spout, rusty orange at first, then gradually clearer. Marcus caught some in his cupped hand. It was ice cold and tasted metallic, but it was water. Actual running water from an underground spring or aquifer. "Oh my God," Marcus whispered. "Scout, there's water here. Actual water." He let it run until it was relatively clear, then drank deeply. It was the best water he'd ever tasted, simply because it was his, something he hadn't had to beg for or sneak from a gas station bathroom. Marcus spent the rest of the morning taking inventory. In his backpack he had one change of clothes, a toothbrush, a small first aid kit, 3 protein bars he'd been saving, $37 in cash, and his dead phone. That was everything he owned in the world. The bunker itself offered more. In the filing cabinets he found old paperwork, nothing valuable, just decades-old supply requisitions and inspection reports. But the paper itself was useful, potential fire starter. In one of the storage rooms, he discovered a metal toolbox containing a few rusted but potentially serviceable tools. A hammer, a screwdriver, pliers, and best of all, a folding saw with a blade that still looked decent. The maps on the wall of the office were fascinating. They showed the bunker's location, marked as Site F-17, and several other similar sites scattered throughout the Colorado mountains, all marked as decommissioned. Marcus traced the trails and roads with his finger, orienting himself. They were about 7 miles from Morrison, maybe 9 from the nearest residential area, close enough to access civilization if needed, far enough to remain hidden. "We need supplies," Marcus told Scout, who was investigating every corner of the bunker with thorough canine diligence. "Food for both of us, blankets, candles or batteries for the flashlight. Maybe some kind of tarp to cover that entrance better." The dog looked at him and wagged his tail. "Yeah, easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to figure out how to get all that up here." But Marcus's mind was already working on the problem. He had $37. There was a King Soopers in Morrison. He'd passed it on previous wanderings. He could hike down, buy essentials, hike back. It would take most of a day, and carrying everything up the mountain would be brutal. But it was doable. The alternative was going back to Denver, back to the streets, back to being invisible and hunted by cold and hunger. Marcus looked around the bunker. dirty, decrepit, forgotten by the world. But it had walls, it had a roof, it had water, and now it had him. "Okay," he said aloud, making the decision final by speaking it. "We're doing this. This is home now." Scout barked once, sharp and approving, as if he'd known all along this was the plan. Marcus smiled despite everything, despite the cold, despite the monumental task ahead, despite the fact that he was a 16-year-old homeless kid trying to survive in an abandoned Cold War bunker. He'd faced worse odds before, and this time he wasn't alone. The hike down was harder than Marcus expected. His legs were already sore from the climb up, and the snow made the trail treacherous. Several times he slipped, catching himself on trees or rocks before he could fall. Scout navigated the descent with ease, bounding ahead and then waiting patiently, while Marcus picked his way down more carefully. By the time they reached the base of the foothills, 3 hours had passed, and Marcus was exhausted, but he pressed on, following roads toward Morrison. The small mountain town was just beginning to stir with mid-morning activity. Pickup trucks on the main street, a few locals grabbing coffee at the cafe, tourists probably heading to Red Rocks Amphitheater. Marcus felt conspicuously out of place and very aware of how he must look. Dirty clothes, tangled hair, a stray dog at his heels. He kept his head down and walked quickly toward the King Soopers he'd spotted on the edge of town. "You gotta stay outside," Marcus told Scout at the entrance. "I know, it sucks, but they won't let dogs in." Scout sat obediently near the bike rack, and Marcus went inside, grabbing a handbasket. With only $37, every choice mattered. He moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, the skill of someone who'd learned to stretch every penny. Ramen noodles, 6 packages for $2, a loaf of day-old bread marked down to $1.50, peanut butter, the cheapest brand $3, a bag of rice, 5 pounds for $4, canned beans, 3 cans for $2, a box of matches, $1, a pack of emergency candles, $2, a gallon of water, $1. Even though he had the pump, it would be useful to have. For Scout, he added a small bag of dry dog food, $8, the cheapest option. It hurt to spend that much on one item, but the dog had saved his life. He deserved to eat. At the checkout, the total came to $34.67. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, barely looked at him as she rang up his items. Marcus handed over 2 20s. Part of him always feared using bills this large, as if someone might question where a kid like him got them. She handed him his change without comment, and Marcus felt a rush of relief. He loaded everything into his backpack, the weight immediately noticeable but manageable. Outside, Scout greeted him with enthusiastic tail wags. Marcus opened the dog food bag right there and poured some into his cupped hands. Scout ate eagerly, and Marcus found himself smiling at the simple pleasure of being able to feed his companion. "Come on, buddy." Long walk back. They'd made it about 2 blocks when Marcus noticed the police car. It was parked outside a gas station, the officer inside sipping coffee and looking at a laptop mounted on his dashboard. Marcus's heart rate immediately spiked. He wasn't doing anything illegal, just walking through town, but his experience with law enforcement had taught him that being young, homeless, and visible was often enough to warrant attention he didn't want. He tried to walk casually, not too fast, not too slow. Don't look guilty, don't look scared, just a kid and his dog, going somewhere with purpose. "Hey, kid!" Marcus's stomach dropped. He turned slowly. The officer had rolled down his window and was looking directly at him. "Yeah?" Marcus managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "That your dog?" "Yes, sir." The lie came automatically. In every way that mattered, Scout was his. "He got tags? Rabies vaccine?" Marcus's mind raced. "Lost his collar a few days ago. We're actually heading to the vet to get him checked out." Another lie, but a believable one. The officer studied him for a long moment. Marcus could see the assessment happening. The worn clothes, the overstuffed backpack, the too thin frame. The officer knew what he was looking at. "You got someplace to go, son? Family around here?" "Yes, sir." "We're staying with my uncle up in Kittredge." The words came out smooth, practiced. Marcus had learned that specificity made lies more believable. Kittredge was close enough to be plausible, small enough that the officer probably wouldn't know every family there. Another long look. Then the officer nodded slowly. "All right. Stay safe. Weather's supposed to turn bad again tonight." "Will do." "Thank you, officer." Marcus walked away at a measured pace, every instinct screaming at him to run. He didn't look back until he'd turned a corner and was out of sight. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. "That was too close," he muttered to Scout. The hike back up the mountain was brutal. The backpack, now loaded with supplies, felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Marcus had to stop frequently to rest, his shoulders aching, his legs trembling with fatigue. The trail seemed twice as long going up as it had coming down. Scout stayed close, occasionally pressing against Marcus's leg as if offering encouragement. The dog seemed to sense Marcus's exhaustion and matched his pace, never rushing ahead. It took them nearly 5 hours to make it back to the bunker. By the time they squeezed through the rusted entrance, the sun was setting, and Marcus was running on pure willpower. He dropped the backpack just inside the door and collapsed beside it, every muscle screaming. Scout curled up next to him, and they lay there together in the gathering darkness, both too tired to move. But they'd done it. They'd gone to town, bought supplies, and made it back without being caught or questioned too closely. The bunker now held food, light, and hope. Marcus pulled out one of the candles and lit it with trembling fingers. The small flame pushed back the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. He opened the peanut butter and tore off a chunk of bread, making a rough sandwich. It tasted like victory. "Day 1, Marcus said quietly, offering Scout a piece of bread. "We actually did it." The dog took the bread gently, and in the candlelight Marcus could have sworn he saw approval in those brown eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had shelter, food, and each other. It was enough. The next 2 weeks became a blur of backbreaking work. Marcus fell into a routine born of necessity. Each morning he'd wake with the dawn, freezing despite having fashioned a makeshift sleeping bag from his extra clothes. He'd light a candle, feed Scout, and eat a small breakfast, usually peanut butter on bread or a few handfuls of dry ramen that he'd learned to soften by soaking in the cold pump water. Then came the work. The bunker was livable, but barely. Marcus attacked each problem systematically, using the limited resources he had and improvising solutions with whatever he could find or carry up the mountain. The entrance was his first priority. The rusted doorframe offered some protection, but wind and cold still knifed through. Using the folding saw from the toolbox, Marcus spent 3 days cutting pine branches and weaving them into a crude but effective windbreak. He positioned it just outside the entrance, leaving enough space to squeeze through, but blocking the worst of the weather. Water wasn't an issue. The pump worked reliably once he'd gotten it moving, but warmth was. The cast-iron stove became his obsession. Marcus studied it carefully, tracing the chimney pipe up through the ceiling. The pipe was mostly intact, though clogged with decades of debris. He used a long stick to push through the blockage, and after hours of work he finally felt air moving freely through the system. Building a fire was another challenge. He had matches, but he needed sustainable fuel. Every other day he'd spend hours gathering deadwood from the surrounding forest, breaking it into manageable pieces with the saw or his hands, and stacking it in one of the empty storage rooms to keep it dry. The work was endless. Feeding the stove required constant fuel, but the reward was worth it. When he finally got a fire going, the heat it produced was transformative. The main room became warm, almost comfortable. Scout proved invaluable. The dog seemed to understand their situation instinctively. He'd alert Marcus to any sounds outside, deer, the occasional coyote, once a black bear that Marcus watched nervously through a crack until it wandered away. Scout also proved to be an excellent hunting companion. Twice, the dog caught rabbits, bringing them back to the bunker. Marcus had never cleaned an animal before, but desperation was an excellent teacher. He used the knife from his first aid kit and learned through trial and error. The meat cooked over the stove was tough but protein-rich, a precious supplement to their meager supplies. The sleeping situation improved gradually. Marcus made another supply run, this time to a different store in Evergreen, varying his pattern to avoid suspicion. He bought a cheap sleeping bag on clearance and more food. The sleeping bag was thin and probably not rated for mountain winters, but it was infinitely better than nothing. He also bought a composition notebook and a pen. Every evening by candlelight, he began keeping a journal, documenting his days, his challenges, his small victories. It helped him think, helped him plan, and gave him a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. November 28th. Fixed the stovepipe. Warmth is everything. Scout caught another rabbit, starting to feel less like we're camping and more like we're actually living here. Is that crazy? Probably, but what's the alternative? The hardest part wasn't the physical work. It was the isolation. Marcus was 16 years old, and despite everything he'd been through, he was still just a kid. There were moments, especially in the long evenings, when loneliness crashed over him like a wave. He missed human conversation, missed laughter, missed the casual interactions that most people took for granted. But he didn't miss the streets. He didn't miss the constant fear, the hunger that gnawed at his insides, the way people looked through him as if he didn't exist. Up here, he was invisible by choice, not by society's rejection. On December 3rd, disaster nearly struck. Marcus was gathering wood about a quarter-mile from the bunker when he heard voices, hikers on the trail below. His first instinct was panic. If they came up here, if they found the bunker, everything would be over. He'd be reported to authorities, sent back to the system, probably separated from Scout. He whistled softly for Scout, and they both froze, listening. The voices grew louder. Two men talking about trail conditions and planning to summit Mount Falcon. Marcus's heart pounded as he calculated distances and paths. Would they come this high? The bunker was off the main trail, but not impossibly far off. He and Scout crept back toward the bunker, moving as quietly as possible. Once inside, Marcus covered the entrance more thoroughly with branches and waited, barely breathing. Scout sensed his tension and remained perfectly still beside him. The voices came closer, then closer still. For 10 agonizing minutes, Marcus was certain they'd be discovered. Then, mercifully, the voices began to fade. The hikers had passed by without noticing the hidden entrance. Marcus sat in the darkness, shaking with adrenaline, and realized how precarious his situation truly was. He was squatting in a government facility. Abandoned or not, it was still technically federal property. If discovered, he'd face consequences he couldn't afford to think about. That night, he reinforced the camouflage around the entrance, making it even less visible from the trail. He also began taking greater precautions. No fires during peak hiking hours, no noise that might carry, constant vigilance. December 3rd, almost got caught today, scared the hell out of me. This isn't sustainable long term, but what choice do I have? Go back to freezing on the streets? At least here I have a chance. Have to be smarter, have to be invisible. Despite the close call, Marcus found himself growing more confident in his ability to survive here. Each problem he solved, each system he improved, each day he made it through, all of it built a foundation that felt increasingly solid. He was doing more than surviving now. He was building something. Whether it could last was a question for another day. The temperatures plummeted into single digits at night, and even with the stove burning constantly, the bunker barely stayed above freezing. Marcus woke each morning with frost on his sleeping bag and his water bottle frozen solid. His supplies were dwindling faster than expected. The cold meant he needed more calories to maintain body heat, and Scout needed more food too. By December 18th, Marcus had $15 left and maybe 4 days of food if he stretched it. The math was simple and terrifying. He needed money, and he needed it soon. He'd avoided this decision for weeks, but there was no getting around it anymore. He had to find work. The problem was obvious. He was 16, homeless, and had no legal guardian to sign work permits. Most places wouldn't hire him, and those that might would ask questions he couldn't answer. But desperation had a way of clarifying options. Marcus made the trek down to Morrison early on a Thursday morning, leaving Scout at the bunker with firm instructions to stay put. The dog had whined but obeyed, seeming to understand the seriousness in Marcus's voice. The town was quiet in the pre-dawn cold. Marcus walked the main street, looking for possibilities. Most businesses were closed or clearly wouldn't need help. Gift shops, art galleries, the kind of places that barely needed staff in winter. But there was a diner called the Mountain View Cafe that showed lights in the windows and had a Help Wanted sign in the door. Marcus stood outside for 10 minutes, building courage. Through the window, he could see the breakfast rush beginning, locals grabbing coffee and eggs before work. Finally, he pushed through the door. The warmth hit him like a wave, along with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. His stomach clenched with hunger. "Sit anywhere, honey," called a woman in her 50s, balancing 3 plates on her arms. She had steel-grey hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the efficient movements of someone who'd been waitressing for decades. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly, "I wanted to ask about the Help Wanted sign." The woman, her name tag read Diane, set down the plates and turned to study him. Marcus saw the assessment in her eyes, similar to the police officers but somehow gentler. She was seeing the same things: worn clothes, thin frame, the unmistakable markers of a kid in trouble. "How old are you?" 18, Marcus lied. "I can start immediately. I'll work hard, any hours you need." "Ooh." Diane's expression suggested she didn't believe the age, but something in her face softened. "You got experience?" "I worked at a diner in Denver for 6 months. Bussing tables, washing dishes, some prep cook work." That part was actually true. It had been his last job before Mrs. Patterson kicked him out. "References?" Marcus hesitated. "The place closed down, owner retired." Another lie, but necessary. Diane looked at him for a long moment. The diner noise continued around them, the sizzle of the griddle, conversations at tables, the ding of the order bell. Marcus held her gaze, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "Tell you what," Diane said finally, "I need someone to help with the breakfast and lunch rushes. Bussing tables, dishwashing, basic prep work. $7 an hour, cash at the end of each shift. No paperwork, no questions. You show up on time, you work hard, you're respectful to customers, and we'll get along fine. You screw up once, and you're done. Deal?" Relief flooded through Marcus so intensely he almost staggered. "Deal. Absolutely. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Be here tomorrow at 6 a.m. Wear clean clothes if you got them. And son," she lowered her voice, "whatever situation you're in, I hope you're finding your way through it. But if you steal from me or cause problems, I won't hesitate to call the cops. Understood?" "Understood. I won't let you down." Marcus worked his first shift the next morning. It was grueling. Hours on his feet, carrying heavy trays of dirty dishes, scrubbing pots and pans in scalding water, wiping down tables during brief lulls. His body ached from the bunker work and the constant hiking, and by hour 3 he was moving on pure willpower. But he didn't slow down, didn't complain, didn't give Diane any reason to regret taking a chance on him. During his break, she brought him a plate of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. "Eat," she ordered. "Can't have you passing out on my floor." Marcus devoured it. The first hot meal he'd had in days beyond his own crude cooking. It was heaven. At the end of the 8-hour shift, Diane handed him $56 in cash. Marcus stared at the bills in his hand, hardly believing it. $56. Food for a week, maybe 2 if he was careful. Fuel for the fire, maybe even a warmer blanket. "Same time Monday?" Diane asked. "I'll be here." Marcus worked 4 days that week, then 5 the next. The routine became his lifeline. Wake before dawn, hike down the mountain, work the breakfast and lunch shifts, buy supplies with his earnings, hike back up before dark. It was exhausting, but it was working. Scout always greeted him with ecstatic joy when he returned, and Marcus started bringing back scraps from the diner, bacon bits, leftover meat, the occasional burger that had been made wrong. Diane noticed but never said anything, just made sure there were mistakes on busy days. The bunker improved with the steady income. Marcus bought a better sleeping bag, rated for winter weather. He got a battery-powered lantern that gave better light than candles. He stocked up on food, real food, not just ramen and rice. He even bought Scout a proper dog bowl and better quality dog food. For the first time since he'd been kicked out of foster care, Marcus felt something that resembled stability. It was fragile, built on lies and luck, but it was something. He should have known it couldn't last. On December 28th, during the lunch rush, 2 men walked into the diner. They wore uniforms, not police but park rangers. They sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and struck up a conversation with Diane. Marcus was in the back, loading the dishwasher, when he heard one of them say, "Found evidence of someone camping illegally up on Mount Falcon. Looks like they've been there a while. Fire pit, trash, the whole deal. We're going to investigate tomorrow, see if we can find who's responsible." Marcus's blood turned to ice. They'd found signs of his presence. Tomorrow, they'd search more thoroughly. Tomorrow, they'd find the bunker. Tomorrow, everything would fall apart. Marcus finished his shift in a daze, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. He could run, pack everything tonight, disappear before the Rangers found the bunker. But go where? Back to Denver's streets in the dead of winter? He'd survived out here for over a month, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Could he really go back to that existence? He could stay and hide, hoping they wouldn't find the bunker's entrance. But that was foolish. If they were doing a thorough search, they'd find it. The camouflage was good, but not that good. And what would happen then? Best case, he'd be reported to social services. Worst case, arrested for trespassing on federal property. The hike back to the bunker felt like walking toward an execution. Scout met him at the entrance, tail wagging, completely unaware that their world was about to collapse. Marcus sat on the floor of the bunker, Scout's head in his lap, and tried to think. He'd fought so hard to build this. The bunker had become more than shelter. It was proof that he could survive, that he could create something from nothing, that he mattered. Losing it felt like losing himself, but maybe that was the problem. Maybe he'd been so focused on surviving alone that he'd forgotten there might be another way. Marcus pulled out his journal and stared at the pages, weeks of entries documenting his struggle, his small victories, his fears. On impulse, he flipped to a blank page and began writing, not an entry, but a letter. To whoever finds this, my name is Marcus Chen. I'm 16 years old, and I've been living in this bunker since November 14th. Before you judge me, please understand, I didn't break in here to cause trouble or damage property. I came here because I was homeless and facing a snowstorm that probably would have killed me. I've tried to take care of this place. I haven't destroyed anything, haven't stolen anything except shelter. I've kept it clean, maintained the structure, and even fixed some things that were broken. The stove works now, the water pump works now. I know I'm trespassing, I know this is government property, but I didn't know where else to go. The foster system gave up on me and I gave up on it. The streets were killing me slowly. Hunger, cold, violence, the constant fear. Up here I had a chance. I found work in Morrison at the Mountain View Cafe. Diane gave me a job when no one else would. I've been paying my own way, buying my own food, not asking anyone for anything. I've been trying to do it right, even if the situation is all wrong. If you're reading this, you probably found me. I won't run or fight. I'm tired of running. Whatever happens next, I just want you to know I'm not a criminal or a delinquent. I'm just a kid who fell through the cracks and tried to find solid ground. The dog's name is Scout. If something happens to me, please make sure someone takes care of him. He deserves better than the streets. Marcus Chen, December 28th, 2024. Marcus read it over twice, then carefully tore the page from the journal and left it on the desk in the office room, weighted down with a rock. Then he sat back down with Scout and waited for dawn. He didn't sleep. He spent the night going through his options one more time, but they all led to the same conclusion. He was out of moves. At first light, he fed Scout and made them both breakfast. He cleaned the bunker more thoroughly than usual, putting everything in order. If this was the end, at least it would be a dignified one. Around 9 a.m., he heard voices. Scout's ears perked up, and Marcus put a hand on the dog's collar, keeping him quiet. The voices grew closer. Definitely park rangers, at least 2 of them, maybe 3. Marcus could hear branches snapping as they searched the area. "Over here!" one called. "I found something." This was it. Marcus took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and made his decision. He crawled through the entrance into the bright winter sunlight. Scout beside him. 3 park rangers stood about 30 feet away, all turning to look at him in surprise. The nearest one, a stocky man in his 40s with a graying beard, reached instinctively for his radio. "Wait," Marcus said, raising his hands. "Please, just wait." The ranger's hand hovered over the radio. "Son, what are you doing up here?" "Living," Marcus said simply. "My name is Marcus Chen. There's a letter inside explaining everything. I'm not running and I'm not fighting. I just need you to read the letter before you decide what to do with me." The second ranger, a woman with sharp eyes and pulled-back black hair, studied him carefully. "You've been living in there, in that old bunker, since mid-November. I know it's trespassing. I know I'm in trouble, but I didn't have anywhere else to go." The rangers exchanged glances. The bearded one finally said, "Stay right there, don't move." He disappeared into the bunker. Marcus waited, Scout pressed against his leg, while the other 2 rangers kept a careful distance. Minutes passed like hours. When the bearded ranger emerged, he was holding Marcus's letter. His expression was unreadable. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, then at Scout, then back at Marcus. "How old did you say you were?" 16, sir." Another long pause. Then the ranger keyed his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Stevens. We've got a situation up on Mount Falcon. I need you to contact social services and—" He paused, glancing at Marcus again. "And tell them we're going to need someone who actually gives a damn. We've got a kid up here who needs help, not punishment." Marcus felt something break open in his chest. Not quite hope, but not despair either. Something in between, something that felt like possibility. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked quietly. Ranger Stevens looked at him with an expression that might have been respect. "That depends on a lot of things, son. But I'll tell you what's not going to happen. You're not spending another night in that bunker, and you're not going back to whatever situation you were running from without a fight. Not if I have anything to say about it." The female ranger added, "And your dog comes with you. Whatever happens, he stays with you. That's non-negotiable." Marcus's vision blurred, and he realized he was crying. He hadn't cried once during the entire ordeal. Not when Mrs. Patterson kicked him out, not during the coldest nights, not through any of it. But now, faced with adults who seemed to actually care what happened to him, the dam finally broke. "Thank you," he whispered. 3 weeks later, Marcus sat in a warm office at a youth services non-profit called Second Chances, Scout sleeping under the chair. Across the desk was Karen Morrison, a social worker who'd been assigned to his case after Ranger Stevens had personally called in every favor he had. "So here's where we are," Karen said, reviewing papers. "We've found you a placement with a foster family that specifically works with older teens. Tom and Linda Barrett. They're experienced, they live in Littleton, and they're okay with Scout as long as he gets proper vet care." Marcus nodded, almost unable to believe it. "And school?" "You'll enroll in January. We're working on getting your transcripts transferred. You'll probably need to repeat some coursework, but you can graduate on time if you stay focused." She smiled. "Diane from the cafe also called. Said she'd hold your job if you want weekend shifts once you're settled." "She did?" Marcus's voice cracked. "She did. Said you're the hardest worker she's ever hired, and she doesn't say that lightly." Karen leaned forward. "Marcus, you've been dealt a terrible hand. What you did up in that bunker, surviving on your own, finding work, taking care of yourself and your dog, that took incredible strength. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. There are people who want to help if you'll let them." Marcus looked down at Scout, who opened one eye and thumped his tail lazily, the dog who'd led him to shelter when he'd needed it most. the dog who'd never given up on him. "I'll try," Marcus said finally. "I'll really try. That's all anyone can ask." As Marcus left the office that afternoon, Scout trotting beside him, he thought about the bunker hidden in the mountains. The Rangers had secured it, documented it, and added it to their historical records. Site F-17 would be preserved now, a Cold War relic with an unexpected additional chapter in its story. Marcus had left something there too, not just the letter, but a part of himself. The part that believed he had to survive alone or not at all. The part that couldn't trust anyone to care. He'd traded that for something harder, but infinitely more valuable. The willingness to accept help. To believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when the old fears returned. But for the first time since Mrs. Patterson had told him to pack his bags, Marcus felt something that had been absent for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. He looked down at Scout, who looked back with those intelligent brown eyes. "Come on, buddy," Marcus said softly. "Let's go home." And together, boy and dog walked forward into whatever came next. If you've made it this far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories. Leave us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating content like this. Thank you for being here with us.